Motorcycles are cool. All of them are cool. Whether they're big or small, pretty or ugly, fast or slow, they're all cool. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, this is the main reasons we get motorcycles. It's because we think they're cool. Now, everybody has different opinions on what cool really means. To some people, a Grom is really cool. And, a big full dresser Harley is cool to others. So cool that sometimes the people that are riding on the big full dresser Harley won't even give the little guy in the Grom a nice motorcycle wave. But one thing is definitely true for most riders considering a motorcycle to buy: they're not getting an old bike. Now, I realize there are reasons not to buy a vintage motorcycle.
Woo! It's not that easy.
And I will be making a video about that at some point, but what I want to do in this video is give you the reasons, many of which I'm guessing you haven't thought about or heard of, for why you should consider buying a vintage motorcycle. Also, I should clarify that I'm primarily talking about motorcycles that came from about 1985 or so and earlier, or maybe even just the 70s and back. One could call a 1991 Honda CBR 250RR a vintage motorcycle, and in some sense it is, and in some sense it's a really cool vintage motorcycle. But I'm really talking about the bikes from the previous era, before the rise of sport bikes as we know them, a time when 100 miles an hour was really, really fast and hundreds of horsepower was entirely unheard of. So I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below, and if you like this video, go ahead and leave it a like. That would be nice. Also subscribe, that's a good thing too. Okay, let's jump right in. Now this might surprise you, but many vintage motorcycles are actually quite a bit lighter than their modern counterparts, in spite of the fact that they're made of very little plastic. They're actually made of heavier materials, but many of them are lighter. Now, of course, this doesn't apply when you're comparing, say, a 60s British bike and a modern Honda, but it does when you're talking about many of the modern classic or retro bikes that we have today in comparison to their actual original counterparts. You would think that an older Triumph Bonneville would be significantly slower and heavier than a modern Bonneville, right? Well, if you actually compare the power to weight ratio of a modern Triumph T100, for example, which is a 900cc parallel twin, to say a 65 Triumph Bonneville, which is only a 650cc parallel twin, you'll find that the old Bonneville produces about 20 less horsepower, and actually until recently, the 900cc modern Bonneville only produced about 10 more horsepower. But now it's producing about 65 horsepower, and the old Bonnie produced about 46 horsepower. But listen to this, the old Bonneville only weighed about 380 pounds wet, whereas the current Bonneville T100 weighs about 520 pounds wet. So when you math everything out and you look at the power to weight ratio, the old Bonneville is only slightly slower than the new one. But again, up until this new 2021 model, the old Bonnie was actually slightly faster than the 900, just in terms of power to weight ratio. I'm not 100% sure that means that it would win in a straight line 0 to 60 or 0 to 100. Maybe it wouldn't, but I'm pretty confident, as we'll look at a little bit later, that old Bonneville would definitely win on the curves just because it's so much lighter. So if you actually had to go onto a racetrack, I would actually put my money on the old Bonneville beating the 900cc, which is a bit sad, I'm not gonna lie. When you compare also, for example, the old Royal Enfield Interceptor, the original Interceptor that the new bike is a copy of, it's actually more powerful, significantly more powerful, and it weighs way less. So there's no comparison between the Interceptors. The new Interceptor, in comparison, is heavy and slow, and it doesn't handle as well. Now, if you were to jump over to an even faster bike from the time, say like a Honda CB750, now you're looking at a bike that will literally drive circles around most of the modern classic bikes. So, something to think about. They're actually faster than you think. They're not all slow and heavy and clunky, unless you get an old Harley. Those are kind of slow and heavy and clunky. Like new Harleys. All right, the second reason to buy a vintage bike, you have more choices, more variety, and really just more options. Now, this might not be entirely true if you are also okay with buying, say, something from, within the last 20 years, and you're comparing that to vintage motorcycles. Yeah, then you have a lot of options, if you're looking at the last 20 years. But if you're only buying a new bike and you're comparing that with a true vintage bike, trust me, you have way more options going with the vintage bike. From the style and feel of bikes from the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, there's literally so much to choose from and so many different brands. You've got loads of Italian bikes you could choose from, British and European bikes, German bikes, all with different character and feel and design. It's true there's lots of variety among new bikes as well, but because you're opening yourself up to literally decades and decades of different brands and different models, you will have more options going with a vintage bike. So this one may be a bit subjective, and I will say that this can change for people. Like today, you might find a Triumph Street Triple super attractive, and in a month, you might start liking the look of a full-on sport bike. You know, at one point, I was pretty set on buying an Interceptor, and then I was gonna buy a new Bonneville, and then I ended up buying an old Triumph. And now I look at the other bikes that I've liked and I'm like, I don't really like them that much anymore. And now I've actually started to see the appeal of a lot of sport bikes, even though I'm probably not gonna buy one. But it's hard to deny that vintage motorcycles pretty much just look better. One way it's been said is that you can tell somebody drew the design out with their hand. You can tell that, you know, a 60s bike was just not drawn on a computer or like made on a computer. So if you don't think that they're more stylish, tell me, why is it that when you ride an old bike, you literally turn heads everywhere you go? Now, it could be nostalgia, it could just be the fact that people are seeing something old and seeing an old machine is cool, and you know, that could be part of it. But the reality is that nobody reacts to an MT-09, other than maybe other motorcycle people. But it's true, like it just does nothing for the average person. And you know, like I said at the beginning, this is really all about being cool. So get a bike that's actually cool. Get an old one. All right, let's go in a different direction for a moment. Vintage motorcycles are way more simple, and this means that you can actually take a stab at working on them. Now, you can do things to modern bikes. Usually this is just add-ons or mods, but you can't actually get in there and start wrenching on a modern bike, or at least you shouldn't, in my opinion, unless you have the right training. Just for warranty purposes, I wouldn't. But there's too much technology, there's too much computer stuff going on. But with old bikes, they're just so simple. If you have a problem, it's probably the carburetor, maybe the timing, a few other things are possible, but these are always gonna be things that you yourself can fix with the right manual. In this sense, they're much more involved and you become much more in tune with the machine, and you really do build more of a relationship with it when you've actually fixed stuff or adjusted stuff. For my bike, for example, it took me about a day to figure out how to change all the oil. That's just because I'm kind of dumb and I have very little mechanical experience. But I felt super accomplished, like having finally figured out how to change the transmission oil and having changed the primary chain case oil and the regular engine oil. Having gotten it all done, trying to do it all right, and actually starting it up, like firing it up for the first time, it just felt really like, I don't know, I felt really accomplished. Old bikes have manuals readily available that tell you exactly how to do everything, from checking your timing to literally taking the engine out of the bike and taking it apart. And most of it is relatively simple. All right, next on the list, old motorcycles are better investments. So one of the main reasons I decided to spend my money on a vintage bike, and specifically a vintage British motorcycle, was that for me, it's hard to justify spending upwards of 10 to 15K on a bike that's only gonna depreciate in value. Now, not every old bike is a good investment, and I wouldn't say that like old vehicles are the best investments you can make. There's other things that you could probably get a better return on. And you do have to keep an old bike for a certain period of time for it to really go up in value. Some old bikes are better investments than others, some just hold their value, but I can guarantee this: if you take care of them, they're probably not gonna go down in value. So if you drop $5,000 to $10,000 on a vintage motorcycle and you get one that's really, worth the money, it runs good, it's clean, it's got no problems, it's probably not gonna lose its value. Now, to make a vintage motorcycle a good investment, I do think that you need to own it for a good chunk of time, maybe like 15 years, to really give it a chance to skyrocket in value. That may not happen, but at least your 10K won't turn into like 2K in 15 years, which is what happens with basically any new bike. If you want your new bike to be a good investment, you would have to keep it for like 50 years. Even the bike I got, this old Triumph, basically what I spent for it is pretty much the same in terms of inflation as if I had bought it new. So if you had bought it brand new and kept it, I guess it would be worth more than I paid for it because it would have had original perfect paint and everything, but it wouldn't have been that great of an investment. It may look like it because, there's a lot more value in terms of actual dollars, but because of inflation, like $1,000 when it came out is like $7,000 now or something like that. All right, the next one is that old bikes and vintage bikes have more character. Now, this is a little bit harder to really quantify, and obviously this is a personal preference, but in general, I'd say that it's fair to say that older bikes have a bit more character. We'll get into sound a bit later, which is a huge factor, but oftentimes character on a motorcycle is actually just unreliability and problems, and that's not necessarily a good thing unless you're wanting to be a mechanic more than a rider. But character can also be things like vibration, like maybe the way the bike shifts different from second to third, just age in general, you know, like the bike will feel aged, the bike will maybe feel more mechanical. Things like external wear, that can definitely be a factor and can actually make a bike have a lot more character, and I love that. I do believe that new bikes can have character as well. You know, for example, a Ducati Panigale has this unique feel and sound, and it gets super hot, and I don't know, that bike has a lot of character in my opinion. But in general, older bikes have a lot more character and a lot more soul than newer ones, and that's partially just because they've lived a lot longer. They're aged and like wise. All right, next we have the community. Now the motorcycle community is generally pretty awesome. There's always a few bad apples, but for the most part, we're all kind of in this together. And the same is true of the vintage crowd. And yes, many of them are older, that can come with problems sometimes, but with that, there really are loads of people ready to help you navigate whatever make or model of vintage bike you have. And this is one of my favorite things about owning a vintage bike. I've joined these different communities and I've had specific people reach out to me and help me a ton. You know, I'm not a huge Facebook fan, but I have found the best place for help on any vintage bike is to find that bike's Facebook group. For me in this case, it's the Vintage Triumph group as well as the Vintage Triumph 350 and 500cc group, both of which are full of people willing to give advice for free and really help you through the process of learning and understanding your bike. Next, we have the fact that they are often more manageable. Many current bikes that are touted as bikes for newer riders really just aren't. Even the retro Triumphs I've mentioned earlier, it's so much easier to ride a bike like mine that literally weighs less than 400 pounds wet, but still has a good chunk of power, or something like a KTM 390. That's why that's such a great beginner bike, because it has enough power to feel like a motorcycle, but it's light enough for you to really handle it. Versus starting on, you know, a Triumph T120 or T100, these are plus 500 pound bikes. They're pretty heavy, but like I said, they're not overwhelmingly powerful. So in that sense, they're good bikes, but they're very heavy for a new rider. Also, though I did say that many vintage bikes are faster than you think, none of them are too fast. Unless you're getting something like a CB750, they all produce pretty much less than like 60 horsepower, and they're all quite manageable and easy to handle. For the most part, unless you're getting like a vintage American bike, which is a whole nother topic for another video. All right, to get back to something I said earlier, when you're riding a motorcycle, you're really just traveling around, basically begging for people to notice you. And if that's the case, you have a much better chance of getting noticed and hence picking up some ladies on an old bike, especially a pretty old bike like my Triumph. Maybe not so much if for some reason you decide to get a 1938 Zundap. Okay, Zundap, I don't know how to say that. That one might get attention, but it's not because it's beautiful, it's just because it's weird looking. All right, last of all, and arguably most important, is the sound. Now, depending on what you're looking for, generally older motorcycles just sound better. And this is simply due to emissions regulations, especially in the last 20 years or so, but even drastically in the past like 5 or 10 years. So here's a quick comparison between my Triumph T100 with just stock pipes on it and the current Triumph T100 that you can buy today. My bike is almost half the CCs, but it literally sounds beefier and more aggressive, and as we know, it's virtually just as fast, arguably faster if we had to actually go around some turns. But that's neither here nor there. My bike just sounds better in my opinion, and that's part of the reason why I bought it. Now you can put custom pipes, and you can rip off like all the emissions regulation systems, and even still, in my opinion, older bikes just sound different, regardless of how big the engine is. Even my dad's little Honda CL350 sounds just as mean and aggressive and fast as almost any bike today, and especially the retro bikes. let's say for some reason I've convinced you, which I'm guessing I probably haven't. Now it's time to actually go pick a bike. Now this might be the best part, and you do have a lot of work to do. You might have books to read, you maybe need to look at different countries and regions, you need to learn about the history of motorcycling in this moment to find the bike that's perfect for you. So maybe you want to buy a 30s or a 40s or 50s Harley because you want to experience that foot clutch and that whole involved starting procedure. Or maybe you want to get a light, fast, well-handling old bike, maybe something British or European. Maybe you have a lot of money and you're feeling brave and you want to try out like a 20s or 30s bike. I will say, if you want to try this out and you want something simple, I would actually recommend just getting an old Honda, maybe an early or mid 70s Honda, maybe a 350 or a 450. They're affordable, they're going up in value. My dad's awesome Honda that he got for like $1,800 and it's all original. Like, it's such a good investment. Honestly, an old Honda, like a 70s Honda, is just as reliable, if not more reliable, than most modern bikes. They're simple to work on, and they're also just really appealing, and you can absolutely put a ton of miles on them. All right, guys, that's enough. Thanks for watching. Again, let me know what you think down in the comments below, and until next time, ride safe.